everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I would like to review A Book of Silence by Sarah Maitland, which is a book that I read a little while ago now. It's probably about 2 months ago, but I've been reading other things but I wanted to review it. It's called A Book of Silence by Sarah Maitland, A Journey in Search of the Pleasures and Powers of Silence. And I got this book because it was on my reading list. I think it must have come up in another book I was reading, and I thought, oh, that looks interesting, because I like silence, because I'm very sound sensitive. As part of being autistic, I think I find I'm very sensitive to sound. I pick up little sounds that other people wouldn't notice necessarily, and it's often little sounds that particularly stress me out, sounds that are unpredictable and jarring and kind of impose themselves on me, and I lack the ability to filter them out. So I can get overloaded very easily by sounds. I think even more so as I've got older, actually, because I've always been sensitive to sound. It's been something all through my life. I think when I was a child, obviously I didn't have a language, I didn't have knowledge to understand the issue. I think I just got rather overwhelmed very easily, like in large groups of people and lots going on. I would kind of get overwhelmed, but I didn't know how to express it, so I couldn't really explain to people what was going on. I just kind of, sort of like shut down and withdrew inward, and then people would attribute it to other things. But the irony is, of course, that I wasn't a silent child in any respects. I was actually a very noisy, very loud, very gregarious child, and who actually made a lot of noise myself. I was very active and very noisy, and I think my noise irritated other people, because it's not the case that just because someone themselves loves quiet silence, that it doesn't follow that they're going to be quiet themselves. As I've got older, I've become a lot more retiring and I guess introverted, and now I am a very quiet person myself as well. But when I was a child, I was very noisy. But I've always had an issue with noise, external noise, not noise I create, that's fine, but noise coming from outside that I haven't controlled, that I'm not in control of. So yeah, and as I say, as I've got older, I've just become a lot more retiring anyway, and a lot more insular, I guess, and I just thought, I'd just quite like to find out a bit more about silence. So that's why I got this book. So what it's about then, I'll just read to you what it says on the back. Sorry, I keep on going like that in my eyes because I'm really tired today. I feel tired. It's one of them days, just tired. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'm just tired, bear with that. But in her late 40s, Sarah Maitland moved out of the city and fell in love with silence. In this profound and evocative book, Maitland explores this fascination, delving into the darkness and euphoria that silence can bring, and considering its cultural history. She contemplates the experience of silence, from her own nights in the desert and weeks on the Isle of Skye, to the accounts of travellers and mystics, and argues for its importance in a world increasingly addicted to noise. So that's essentially what it's about. Sarah Maitland, she's a novelist. I haven't actually read any of her books, so I hadn't even really heard of her until this book. She basically took herself away to experience silence firsthand. So she went off to the Isle of Skye and various other really remote places to try and experience silence away from people. And also during this kind of, like, I guess you could call it a sort of spiritual journey, it's very kind of almost quite New Agey. She also kind of researched the history of silence. There's a lot about religion in this book, particularly Christianity, which obviously I'm not a Christian or anything, I'm not religious. But because Sarah Maitland is a religious person, I think that explains why there's a lot in here about religion. But although I'm not religious, I found that quite interesting, because I am quite interested in religion anyway, although I'm not religious myself, so I thought that was quite fascinating. So I just thought I would just go through the sort of main things from this book that I thought were interesting. So one of the things in the book that I thought was quite interesting was a bit in there about reading books, and the question over whether or not reading it can be really described as silent or not, because it depends. Sarah suggests that it depends really on the meaning of silence. Is silence about there being no words or no sound? Because if silence is just merely about there being no sound, then you could say, well, reading is a very silent activity, at least if a person is reading quietly. But if silence is, technically speaking, if silence has to be non-verbal, as it were, so no words, no language, then reading is actually quite a noisy activity, because it's all about narrative. So it depends on what you mean by silence. But the thing that I found quite interesting, that isn't directly related to silence, but so I'm just really tired, but but I found quite fascinating, because it kind of spoke to me, was the developmental aspect of reading, whereby, and this is on page 147, whereby beginners tend to read aloud, or at least moving lips, whereas full reading competence is usually judged by the ability to read silently. So, as a person learns to read fluently, the connection between the arbitrary black marks on the page and oral language disappears, and practiced readers absorb the meaning from the text entirely visually, without having to use the sort of auditory sense to kind of get the meaning out. Although some people do have a sort of internal kind of like a sort of voice internally, but they don't need to articulate it. It can be done completely silently, because most of the meaning is taken in visually, and apparently this can actually now be neurologically proven. But reading was not silent until the 4th century, because up until that point, everyone who read aloud. So in the distant past, everyone read aloud. The notion of silent reading was completely unheard of. But nowadays, there's often like this kind of cultural assumption that people who read aloud or move their lips when they're reading are somehow a little bit thick. There's this kind of like stereotype. So, for example, in the sitcom Friends, Joey always moves his lips as he reads, and this is a stock joke to show that he is thick and uneducated. But in the past, it used to be seen as much more an aristocratic accomplishment before the 4th century to be reading aloud, and this was because the level of interpretation required to read meant in classical times that fluent reading could only be done after an extensive education. So back in those days, reading was not about unravelling plots and discovering secrets. It was all about showing off your level of education, and it was very much a sort of a very quite loud activity, not a silent activity. People would be reading aloud. But nowadays, one of the effects of easier reading is that it has radically reduced the depth of textual memory in even the well-educated. It's a lot more kind of like superficial, because people tend to like skim the text and get the meaning out visually, but they don't need to spend lots of time kind of, it's a different thing. But I found this interesting because I can't, and I don't know whether it's due to my autism or not, and obviously all autistic people are different, so you may or may not relate. And just because I experience this doesn't mean that other autistic people are going to experience it, but I do think it possibly is part of my autism, is that I find it really, really hard to read silently. I can read silently. It's not that I can't read silently. I can read silently, but the problem is that I find it really hard to hold the meaning in my head in order to remember it and to make sense of what I'm reading, to comprehend it. If it's like really basic text and I'm not expected to do it for that long, I can do it. But the more complicated the text is, and the longer I have to concentrate on the text, the harder it becomes, and it becomes incredibly hard, almost excruciatingly difficult for me then to read silently and to extract meaning from the text. So in order to really read and make sense of the information and to hold that information in my mind and to kind of really feel like I'm making sense of it, I have to read aloud. I have to I have to whisper the words, quite emphatically actually, to really draw out the meaning. If it's too loud, that can sometimes getting away with meaning, because then I get distracted by my voice. But if it's too quiet, then I'm not getting a meaning. So I've kind of learned how to get this kind of just right kind of whispering, to not too loud but not too quiet, which is the optimum level. The optimum. My mind's gone. Yeah, the optimum loudness, I guess, to kind of extract the meaning. And when I was younger, when I was a child, I really struggled with comprehension at school. This was picked up on by teachers, and in my educational psychology report, it was picked up on because I could decode really well. You know, I learned to read really young before I started school, but the problem was that I didn't really understand what I was reading. I couldn't answer questions about the plots. I lost track of the meaning really quickly, so I was really just taking on board. Yeah, I could read, I could pick out for words and stuff, but I didn't have the comprehension to go with it. So there's this really big gap between my reading age and my comprehension ability. And I think what happened was, eventually I realised that if I were to read aloud, I actually could understand it a lot easier. And I'm not sure when I came to this realisation. I think it must have been maybe when I was a teenager. And when I was learning for exams, I found the easiest way to remember and take on board information was to read aloud. It used to drive my parents nuts because they didn't like the fact I was reading aloud, you know, because I did, you know, they didn't like it, particularly when I was reading my Titanic book over and over again and I'd read it aloud. But it really helped with my memory, and I do have quite a good memory for verbal text, but in order to memorise it, I have to read aloud. Now, I do have synesthesia as well, which I think also helps me remember text as well, because I see the text as having colour, you know, it's coloured, which definitely helps. But reading aloud really helps me to draw out the meaning. So I thought it was quite interesting, the fact that developmentally all children learn to read, reading aloud, and that silent reading happens. You know, it's not something that happens overnight. It's a developmental thing. And most children do eventually acquire, and that's said to be the key marker of like fluency. But I can't do that, or at least I can't do it with any ease, at least not in terms of drawing out complicated meaning, and particularly when I'm expected to concentrate and do it over a longer period of time, particularly when there's lots of noises in the background. When I'm around other people, I try and fake silent reading because I don't want to stand out, but then I'm not really taking in much information, and it's almost like I'm not really connecting it properly. It feels like only part of it is going in. But yeah, it's interesting also that in the past, this element of reading is a recent thing, and in the past it was a sign of being aristocratic to be able to read aloud, because reading was more a sign of like an advanced education, and it was very much a public activity, and no one read silently in the distant past. It's a big leap to nowadays thinking that if someone reads aloud that they're somehow stupid. Of course it isn't the case, because there's a whole range of reasons why someone might read aloud, and people like myself, not because I'm stupid, it's just the way I am. But yeah, I just thought that was really interesting. So I'm going to move on to video number 2 now.